Let me ask you something. Have you ever seen a book that billions of people swear by and yet millions are told to stay away from? I want to talk about that book, the Qur'an. Not from a religious bias, but from an educational lens. Because this isn't just about belief. It's about influence. It's about truth. It's about why people fear what they don't understand. Let's get this straight. The Qur'an didn't just arrive in the deserts of Arabia and stay there. It sparked something much bigger than anyone expected. It started a ripple effect that reshaped civilizations, rewrote the course of human knowledge, and redefined the relationship between faith, science, governance, and identity. You don't have to be Muslim to see that the Qur'an was a catalyst for global transformation. That's not religious bias. That's historical fact. When the Qur'an was first revealed in the 7th century, the Arabian Peninsula was a tribal society. Literacy was rare, political unity non-existent. Yet this book, recited in powerful rhythmic Arabic, began to change the mindset of a people. It transformed scattered tribes into a movement grounded in discipline, ethics, and intellectual purpose. That's not magic. That's momentum. And here's what most people overlook. The Qur'an didn't just create religious rituals. It produced thinkers, scientists, leaders. When the Qur'an called people to observe nature, to reflect, to read, to question, those are revolutionary calls. At a time when most of the world believed in inherited knowledge from monarchs and elites, the Qur'an told ordinary people, read, think. You are capable. That one word, read, was the first revealed command. Not believe, not pray, but read. That alone should tell you something. It laid the foundation for an intellectual revolution that would stretch across centuries and continents. Fast forward a few decades, the Qur'an inspired a civilization that built the world's first universities in Fez and Baghdad, developed hospitals, and revolutionized the scientific method. Muslim scholars, fueled by a sense of divine curiosity, translated ancient Greek texts, studied astronomy, invented surgical tools, mapped the stars, and developed algebra. Yes, algebra, while Europe was still in the Dark Ages. What made this explosion of knowledge possible? A worldview driven by the Qur'an's insistence that learning is sacred. It doesn't stop there. The Qur'an introduced systems of governance that emphasized accountability, justice, and consultation, ideas we now associate with democracy and human rights. The concept of a leader being servant of the people didn't start with modern politics. It's embedded in Quranic principles of leadership. And the Qur'an didn't only preach these values, it challenged its followers to live them. It also promoted unity across racial and ethnic lines. In a world divided by birth status and social class, the Qur'an declared, "The most honored among you in the sight of God is the most righteous." That was radical. That was global. That's the kind of worldview that dismantles empires, not through violence but through ideas. So when we talk about the Qur'an changing the world, it's not just poetic language, it's history. From science to ethics, to the birth of global trade routes, rooted in trust and honesty, the Qur'an's principles made Muslims curious, disciplined, and expansive in their thinking. It made them teachers to the world at a time when others were still clinging to myth and monarchy. The question is not whether the Qur'an changed the world, it clearly did. The real question is, why aren't more people talking about it today? And perhaps deeper than that, why are so many afraid of what this book still has the power to do when it's understood, not feared? Because if a book could take a fragmented society and elevate it to the heights of civilization, innovation, and moral clarity, what might happen if people of any background started reading it again, not with prejudice but with purpose? That's not just a question for Muslims, that's a question for anyone who values knowledge, growth, and transformation. Let's talk about something that often gets overlooked when people talk about the Qur'an: its language. Not the translation, not the interpretation, the actual language, the way it speaks, the way it lands, the way it cuts through noise with this clarity and force that makes you pause, even if you don't fully understand it. Now, I don't care what your background is, when words hit with rhythm, purpose, and weight, you feel it. And that's exactly what the Qur'an does. The Qur'an is not written like a storybook. It's not a casual read. It's not a man-made speech with fluff and filler. It's intentional. Every verse, every syllable is placed with surgical precision, and it demands attention. There's a reason why when it was first recited it silenced crowds. Arab poets, masters of the most eloquent language on earth at the time, were stunned. These were people whose culture revolved around poetry, oral tradition, metaphors, rhyme. They lived through language. But when the Quran was heard for the first time, it didn't sound like poetry. It didn't sound like prose either. It was something completely other, something they couldn't match. Even the Quran itself throws down the challenge. Bring something like it if you can, and no one ever has. This isn't just a religious claim, it's a linguistic phenomenon. People who study Arabic, even non-Muslim scholars, admit there is a power in the original Quranic text that gets lost in translation. Why? Because the Quran uses a unique structure, elliptical, rhythmic, but balanced. It layers meanings. One word in Arabic can hold multiple dimensions. It can be historical and futuristic, literal and metaphorical, emotional and intellectual, all at once. That's not just clever writing, that's timeless design. Now let's talk tone. The Quran doesn't whisper, it speaks directly to you. It confronts. It says things like, do they not reflect? Are you going to deny the truth when you see it? You were nothing, then I formed you. It's not passive. It doesn't ask politely. It calls you out. It reminds you who you are and who you're pretending to be. That's uncomfortable for some people. And let's be honest, that's exactly why some people fear it. Because most of us live in a world where we're used to soft messages. We like being told we're okay, we're enough, everything's fine. But the Quran doesn't coddle you. It speaks like a mirror. It shows you your reflection, flaws and all. And then it says, now rise above this. That's what real clarity looks like. Not vague inspiration, but honest confrontation. And in a society addicted to noise, fluff and distraction, the Quran slices through with unmatched sharpness. No sugarcoating, no vague ideas, just raw, powerful truth. And that precision, it's not accidental. The Quran isn't arranged chronologically. It doesn't follow a typical narrative structure. And yet every verse links to the next with meaning, like pieces of a cosmic puzzle. You read one chapter and suddenly a line from another chapter makes deeper sense. The more you study it, the more layers emerge. That's why scholars can study it for decades and still feel like they've only scratched the surface. So why does that scare people? Because power in words is power over minds. And if the Quran speaks with that much clarity and force, then people start to wonder, what else am I missing? What else have I misunderstood? That's the threat. Not violence, not chaos, but awakening. You want to know why the Quran is feared? It's not just what it says, it's how it says it. With confidence, with clarity, with command. It doesn't just talk to your ears, it goes straight to your core. And in a world full of half-truths, that kind of speech, it's not just rare, it's revolution. If there's one thing that makes the Quran a force to be reckoned with, it's this. It doesn't just preach personal spirituality, it stands toe-to-toe with power. It calls out corruption, it exposes hypocrisy, and it does so unapologetically. That's not something you see often in religious texts. But the Quran doesn't tiptoe around injustice. It tackles it head-on. From the moment it was revealed, the Quran disrupted the status quo. It didn't come to comfort the elite, or validate unjust systems. It came to liberate minds and shift the power dynamic. Think about it. The early message of Islam came in a society where the poor were trampled, women were dehumanized, and tribal elites had absolute control. And here comes a message that says, no superiority except by righteousness. That's not just spiritual talk, that's a direct threat to the entire hierarchy. The Quran says, do not consume one another's wealth unjustly. Do not betray trusts. Stand firm in justice, even if it is against yourselves, your parents, or your kin. That's intense. That's uncomfortable. And that's exactly why the Quran was met with so much resistance. Because when people in power are told that their privilege, their abuse, their manipulation will be held accountable, they push back. The Quran doesn't just address individuals, it addresses systems. It talks about Pharaoh not just as a man, but as a symbol of tyranny. It talks about the people who followed him out of fear, comfort, or convenience. And then it asks you, are you standing up for truth, or are you staying quiet to protect your position? That kind of mess, it makes oppressors nervous, because it means religion is no longer something you lock inside a temple or a ritual. It's something that walks into the courtroom, into the marketplace, into politics. It demands fairness. It demands truth. And you know what? That message never expires. You can read verses that are over 1400 years old, and they speak to today's headlines: corrupt leaders, economic exploitation, false propaganda, social injustice. The Quran doesn't just describe the symptoms, it names the disease, and then it calls on you to treat it. That's where the fear comes from, not from violence, not from radicalism, but from a text that makes people uncomfortable with the lies they've built their comfort on. Because let's be honest, it's easier to ignore injustice when no one's calling it out. But the Quran calls it out over and over and over again. It tells believers enjoin what is right, forbid what is wrong, not when it's convenient, not when it's popular, but always. It commands accountability, starting with yourself and extending outward to your family, your leaders, your society. Now ask yourself, what kind of system welcomes that? What kind of tyrant says, sure, go ahead, question my authority? They don't. They fear it, because truth is power. Truth disrupts control, and that's exactly what the Quran does. It recenters the power in moral values, not money, injustice, not status. It breaks down the illusion that the strong are always right, that the rich are always blessed, that the silent are always safe. It turns the table. It puts the weak, the oppressed, the forgotten front and center, and it says to them, you matter, you are seen, you are not helpless, you are not voiceless, and if no one else will stand for you, this message will. So yes, the Quran is feared, but not because of what you've been told to fear. It's feared by those who know that once people really understand it, they'll stop tolerating injustice, they'll stop obeying blindly, they'll start asking questions, and when people start asking questions, empires fall, systems shake, change begins. The Quran does something that few books, even today, dare to do. It puts you, the individual, at the center of responsibility, dignity, and transformation. It doesn't speak only to scholars or kings or people with titles. It speaks to everyone, the worker, the mother, the orphan, the prisoner, the seeker. It says you are not small, you are not powerless, you matter. Now that's a powerful message, because think about the world we live in. We're constantly being told we're not enough, that we need more followers, more money, more approval, more validation to be worthy. But the Quran flips that entire narrative. It tells you that you were born with purpose, that your worth isn't based on your bank account, your last mistake, or your status in society. It's based on your intentions, your actions, your character. There's a verse in the Quran that says, whoever does an atom's weight of good will see it, and whoever does an atom's weight of evil will see it. Do you know what that means? It means nothing you do is insignificant. It means even when no one is watching, it still counts. That's not just spiritual motivation. That's deep psychological empowerment. Because if you believe that your smallest actions matter, then you start living on purpose. You stop waiting for someone to save you or fix your life, and you start owning your choice. The Quran holds each person accountable, but also uplifts them with the message that change starts within. It literally says, God does not change the condition of a people until they change what is within themselves. That's radical. It's not saying wait for a miracle. It's not saying wait for a better government, or a perfect environment, or more luck. It's saying start with you, your mindset, your habits, your integrity, your discipline. That's where change begins. That's not always an easy message to hear, because it strips away excuses, but it also strips away helplessness. And that's what makes it so empowering, because in a world that often makes people feel small and disposable, the Quran looks you in the eye and says, you are responsible, you are capable, you have a soul, and it is your most powerful tool. It also speaks directly to the forgotten, the ones society throws aside, the orphan, the widow, the immigrant, the poor, the oppressed. And it doesn't just say have sympathy for them, it says protect them, uphold their dignity, They have right. In fact, some of the strongest condemnations in the Quran are reserved for those who abuse power or turn their back on the vulnerable. What that means is that the Quran isn't just empowering the individual spiritually, it's redefining what power looks like. It's saying, the real strength isn't in domination, it's in compassion, in standing up for justice, in controlling your anger, in giving when you have little. That's power. And here's something else. The Quran doesn't let you give up on yourself. It constantly reminds you that no matter how far you fall, no matter how many mistakes you've made, you can always return. One of the most repeated phrases in the Quran is God is most forgiving, most merciful, not once, over and over. Why? Because the path to empowerment isn't a straight line. It's messy, it's hard, and you're gonna stumble, but that doesn't disqualify you. So yes, the Quran empowers, not through fantasy, not through empty promises, but through a raw, honest message. You are here for a reason. You are stronger than you think. Your voice matters. Your choices matter. You can live with meaning on your terms, with accountability, with courage and with direction. That kind of empowerment doesn't just lift people, it transforms them. And transformed people, they transform the world. Let's get one thing clear. The Quran doesn't ask you to follow blindly. It doesn't tell you to shut down your mind. In fact, it does the opposite. Over and over again, the Quran pushes you to think, to ask, to reflect, to question, to learn. This book doesn't just guide your heart, it demands the engagement of your mind. And that is what has made it so powerful for so many and so intimidating for others. The Quran uses the word think in its various forms hundreds of times. It says, will you not reflect? Do they not use their reason? Do they not see how the earth and heavens were created? These aren't rhetorical lines, they're challenges, they're provocations. The Quran is literally telling you, don't accept things at surface level, dive deep. You don't need to be a scholar or philosopher to get this. What the Quran is saying is simple but revolutionary. Faith is not the opposite of reason. Faith must walk with reason. It tells you to observe nature, study history, examine yourself, explore the universe. This was centuries before scientific method was even a phrase. The Quran lit the spark that would later ignite one of the greatest intellectual eras in human history. Here's what most people miss. The early Muslims were obsessed with learning not because it made them look good, but because the Quran commanded it. It wasn't optional. Seeking knowledge was considered an act of worship. And that mindset changed the world. Muslim scholars preserved and advanced medicine, astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, not because they were looking for prestige, but because they believed learning was a divine responsibility, and this wasn't learning for the elite only. The Quran never says only men should learn, or only the wealthy, or only the religious class. No, the Quran speaks to every single person. It democratized knowledge before that was even an idea. It said, are those who know equal to those who do not know? The answer is obvious. Knowledge elevates you, not in status but in consciousness. That's why ignorance is not just a gap in understanding in the Quranic worldview. It's a danger, because ignorance leads to arrogance. It leads to oppression. It leads to blind following. And the Quran wants nothing to do with that. It wants wakefulness, awareness, conscious decision-making. That's why it doesn't lay everything out in black and white. It gives you principles. It gives you signs. And then it asks you to engage, to ask yourself, what does this mean for me, for my community, for this moment in history? And you know what? That's not comfortable. It's much easier to be told what to think than to actually think. But the Quran doesn't take shortcuts. It says the road to truth requires effort. That's why it praises those who reflect, those who observe, those who study the natural world. In fact, it directly ties knowledge to awe. The more you know, the more humble you become. That's the paradox. The Quran doesn't build ego through knowledge, it breaks it. It reminds you how vast this universe is, and how small you are, and yet it says you still matter. The Quran doesn't just tolerate science, reason, intellect. It celebrates them. It makes the pursuit of knowledge part of the human mission. And that's one of the most revolutionary aspects of the book. Because if you take a person, any person, and you give them access to tools of thought, to questions, to knowledge, You give them power, you give them freedom, you give them the ability to rise. That's why the Quran is feared in some circles, not because it closes minds, but because it opens them. And open minds, they can't be controlled, they can't be manipulated, they don't fall for lies or follow blindly, they build, they heal, they innovate, they lead. And that's a threat to anyone who benefits from ignorance. So when the Quran says reflect, it's not just spiritual advice, it's a strategy to free the human mind. And once that happens, there's no going back. Let's cut to the truth. People don't fear what they understand, they fear what threatens their control. And when it comes to the Quran, the fear isn't because it's violent, extreme, or backward. That's the narrative people push when they haven't read a single verse. The real reason systems of power fear the Quran is because it liberates minds. It challenges their dominance. It dares to say, no one owns you but God. And that's dangerous to anyone who profits from keeping you small. See, when a person truly engages with the Quran, really studies it, reflects on it, they begin to see the lies around them. They start questioning who benefits from their obedience, their silence, their struggle. The Quran tears down the illusion that your worth is defined by your status, your race, your gender, or your paycheck. It puts power and responsibility back in your hands, not the politicians, not the celebrities, not the corporations, yours. Now imagine that kind of mindset spreading. Imagine millions of people around the world saying, I will not bow to false power, I will not be bought, I will stand for justice even if I stand alone. You think corrupt regimes want that? You think exploitative systems are ready for people who can't be controlled by fear or distracted by lies? No way. That's why the Quran gets twisted in the media. That's why it's misquoted, misunderstood, and often not even read before it's judged. Because if people really knew what it said, if they understood that it teaches liberation, dignity, personal strength, and accountability, then they'd stop being passive, they'd stop being afraid, they'd start to rise. The Quran is not just a book of prayers, it's a book of movement, a book of awakening. It reprograms the way you see the world and yourself. And once you start seeing clearly, you stop playing by other people's rules. Let's be real, systems of control depend on your confusion. They rely on you being too distracted, too disempowered, or too exhausted to ask the right questions. They want you to believe you're too small to make a difference. They want you numb, entertained, obedient. But the Quran shatters that. It says you matter, your voice has value, your decisions shape your destiny. It tells you that every act of injustice is being recorded, that every tyrant will be held accountable, that truth will prevail, that your silence in the face of oppression is a choice, not protection. That is terrifying to anyone whose power is built on fear, lies, and division. And let's talk about unity. The Quran doesn't just empower individuals, it builds communities. It calls for solidarity, for mercy, for justice that applies to everyone, not just the elite. That kind of unity, it's a direct threat to systems that depend on division, because divided people are easier to manipulate. But people grounded in truth and unified in purpose, they can't be broken. So yes, the Quran is feared, but not for the reasons people think. It's feared because it wakes people up, because it teaches them how to think for themselves, because it challenges every unjust system that relies on control instead of compassion. And you know what? That fear tells us something. It tells us the Quran is still doing what it was meant to do: disrupt falsehood, empower the humble, and speak truth to power, loud, clear, and unapologetic. Because once you realize that you answer to no one but the Creator, not a government, not a corporation, not a culture, you become unshakable, you become free. And nothing scares corrupt power more than a person who cannot be bought, silenced, or owned. That's why they fear the Quran, because it doesn't just change beliefs, it changes people, and changed people, they change everything. So here's the truth, and I want you to hear it loud and clear. The Quran isn't feared because it's misunderstood. It's feared because when it is understood, it becomes unstoppable. This book didn't just sit on a shelf. It shook empire. It transformed illiterate tribes into leaders of civilization. It called out injustice, tore down arrogance, and lifted up the oppressed. It gave knowledge to the seeker, power to the individual, and purpose to those who felt forgotten. It taught people to ask questions, to think critically, to reflect deeply, and to live boldly. And that's exactly why those in power, those who profit from ignorance and silence, have always feared it. Because the Quran doesn't serve power, it checks it. It doesn't tell people to conform, it tells them to stand up. It doesn't numb people into submission, it awakens them. And once a person is awake to truth, to justice, to their own God-given worth, there's no going back. This book, the Quran, changed the world, not with weapons or wealth, but with words that lit a fire in hearts, words that made people walk away from corruption, defy tyrants, and rebuild societies from the ground up. And that's not ancient history, that's what it still does today. So when someone tells you to fear the Quran, ask yourself, what are they really afraid of? Because the real fear isn't in the book itself, it's in what happens when people actually start living by it. That's why this book is not just a book, it's a revolution, it's a challenge, it's a call, and for those ready to rise, it's the spark that starts everything. So don't fear the Quran, understand it, engage with it, live by it, and become the kind of person the world can no longer ignore, because that is how you change the world.